This is an LA Times Studios podcast.
Hi, it's Chris Goffard at LA Times Studios. Today's episode of Crimes of the Times follows the rise and fall of the legendary automaker John DeLorean. It's a tale of arrogance, ambition, and cocaine. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. One day in October of 1982, automaker John DeLorean was walking down the hallway of a Sheraton hotel near LAX. He was a desperate man. He'd always been known as a maverick among Detroit automakers, a taker of big risks. But recently he had done what seemed impossible. He had launched his own car company. The first cars were on the road, turning heads. They were a vision from the future with gull wings and stainless steel bodies. But DeLorean was bleeding money. His life's work was unraveling, and he needed cash fast to keep his company afloat. DeLorean walked into room 501 at the Sheraton. It was a trap. FBI agents were secretly filming the meeting. There was John DeLorean, flamboyant hero of American capitalism, Promethean icon of the auto world, taking a seat amid a host of shadowy-looking characters. There was John DeLorean peering into a huge briefcase packed with cocaine, pronouncing the drugs better than gold, raising a champagne glass to toast the shady deal. That footage would eventually be seen by millions of people. And more incriminating videos would surface, more clandestine hotel meetings with DeLorean in conversation with murky figures. It's hard to imagine how the FBI's footage amounted to anything other than an open and shut criminal conviction. And during DeLorean's 6-month trial, his attorneys had the seemingly impossible task of convincing jurors to disregard the video. Instead, they portrayed it as a kind of illusion, stage-managed by a government hell-bent on a big trophy. From LA Times Studios, this is Crimes of the Times. I'm Christopher Goffard.
When I started getting into the minutia of John's story, he was a dreamer.
This is Tamir Ardon.
He was a guy that pulled off certain things that were unimaginable at the time in the auto world, and also had this crazy lifestyle that sort of flamed out in a very tabloid, larger-than-life way.
Ardon is a filmmaker who spent 15 years working to bring his 2019 documentary, Framing John DeLorean, to the screen.
And through it all, he maintained this sort of Bill Clinton-esque charm about him that made him a very lovable character to the outside world. And to those that knew him best and were associates with him, they either hated him or loved him. I mean, there was very little gray. And so I was attracted to that end of it.
Ardon was 17 when he got his first DeLorean. He loved it so much that he made a website with his brother dedicated to the car.
I had a lot of admiration for him as an engineer, as a business person, as someone that had sort of cultivated the idea of branding himself, doing a lot of innovative things that didn't even have terms associated with them before they actually did.
When Ardon was 19, he looked up John DeLorean's phone number and cold called him. It was publicly listed.
I told him I was coming out to New Jersey and I would love to stop by and connect with him, and that I was a young DeLorean owner, and he was very warm and gracious on the phone and said, sure, give me a buzz when you're out here. And that was sort of the beginning of my relationship.
10 years before DeLorean walked into the FBI trap in room 501 at the Sheraton, he had left a $600,000 a year job at General Motors, where he'd been a legend. He'd grown up in Detroit in a working-class neighborhood, and his father was a Ford foundry worker. DeLorean got an engineering degree and rose rapidly at Chrysler, Packard, and General Motors. In 1961, he became chief engineer at GM's Pontiac division. He introduced two popular muscle cars, the GTO and the Firebird.
John was very good at sort of earmarking ways to do things that were potentially morally wrong, but legally in a gray area. So the Pontiac GTO, there was a mandate where you weren't allowed to put a certain sized engine in a certain framed car. And John was like, I don't want to be the old ladies division, which Pontiac was looked at that point within the echelon of the General Motor divisions. And he decided, along with Bill Collins, another wonderful engineer, to put an oversized engine in the Pontiac Tempest and call it the GTO. It was a risk because the upper brass had said that you shouldn't be able to do this, but then they started selling like hotcakes. And all of a sudden, the Pontiac division was profitable beyond anyone's imagination. It's sort of built into John's brain, this idea that if I push the limits, if I take risks, even if it's against the grain, I'm going to be rewarded for it.
By 1972, DeLorean was a vice president at GM. People spoke of him as a likely candidate for the president's job.
This sort of renegade badass who continued to get promoted and be the youngest at every step of the way, to the point where he was the youngest VP of the company. And if he had just played his cards right and wasn't so contrarian, he would have become the president of General Motors over time.
The American auto industry typically did not produce celebrities, but DeLorean was the exception, the rare executive who cut a large public profile. He radiated glamour. As a businessman, he was adroit at personal branding years before it became part of the playbook. He was a visionary carmaker years before Elon Musk. Profile writers frequently described him as dashing and dapper, as a jet-setter and a swinger. He wore scarves and flared pants and open shirts. He had his chin surgically augmented. He grew long sideburns. He dated starlets. At 48, DeLorean married his third wife, 22-year-old model Christina Ferrari. They lived opulently in a Fifth Avenue, New York apartment. They also had a 430-acre estate in Bedminster, New Jersey. Ferrari had a needlepoint pillow that said, "Nouveau is better than not riche at all." DeLorean's outsized personality and flamboyant lifestyle clashed with the buttoned-up culture at General Motors. Friction was building, and so in 1973, DeLorean quit, or he was pushed out, depending on what version you believe. After leaving GM, he pursued an audacious goal. He aimed to do what no one had done successfully since the 1920s, launch his own car company. His vision was to build an ethical sports car. It would be safe, practical, and impervious to rust. It would be what he called very beautiful aesthetically. DeLorean persuaded the British government to pour more than $140 million into the project, and he opened a plant in Northern Ireland.
What did he pull off that was so epic in the automotive?
Well, not since Walter Chrysler had someone successfully started their own car company to compete with the big three, GM, Chevrolet, Chrysler. I mean, I think John would be in absolute awe of what Tesla has done, because they basically stole the playbook right from John, which was this idea of starting with a sports car, an ethical car. In John's case, it was a car that was built out of stainless steel, would not rust, and be sexy, fun, futuristic. He was then planning on doing a sedan, and he wanted to make a mass production company, as opposed to other car companies that have come out like Ferrari and Lamborghini and all these other ones that were limited run specialty companies. Porsche, for instance.
From 1980 to 1982, about 9,000 DeLoreans rolled out of the factory.
The car was nicknamed the DMC-12, and that was because it was supposed to be $12,000 to try and be competitively priced with the Corvette.
But there were complications immediately.
There wasn't a lot of room in people's budgets for a second or third sports car in their garage. The price that actually the car went on sale for was between $26,000 to $29,000. And, back in 81, in today's day and age, that's like a $80,000, $90,000 sports car.
The car was plagued by mechanical and electrical problems. Some people found themselves trapped inside when the electronic gull-wing doors didn't function. Tonight Show host Johnny Carson, who was an investor in DeLorean's company, acquired a DMC-12 that broke down on the road.
In the beginning, early stages, when you got a car that's overpriced, didn't necessarily deliver on what John was famous for, which was performance types of cars, being someone that, was part of the creation of the GTO. The engine was slightly anemic. They were going to figure out a solution for that by having a twin turbo system in it, which would have been incredible.
With all these problems, the car flopped on the market. The British government pulled its funding. And by early 1982, the DeLorean Motor Company was insolvent. This is what led up to his visit to the Sheraton Hotel later that year, and the FBI trap waiting inside. With John DeLorean's dream on the verge of collapse and his company hurtling toward bankruptcy, he flew to Los Angeles in October 1982 for a clandestine meeting near LAX. Inside room 501 at the Sheraton Hotel were men posing as underworld figures with a deal that promised to help him. They turned out to be federal agents and one informant. By the evidence of the FBI footage, DeLorean seemed to be in a great mood. One of the men opened a cocaine-filled suitcase in front of him. DeLorean said, "It's better than gold." He toasted with a glass of champagne and added, "Here's to a lot of success for everybody." Federal agents thought they had what they needed. They swept in to arrest him. He surrendered quietly as they cuffed him behind his back. John DeLorean was charged with scheming to buy and resell 220 pounds of Colombian cocaine in a desperate bid to save his company. He faced a 67-year prison term if he was convicted. DeLorean's image would never recover. He became the butt of jokes. Saturday Night Live did a sketch in which a frantic DeLorean is shoving cocaine into a briefcase for an upcoming flight. His innocent, clueless wife thinks it's sugar. Eddie Murphy's character shows up to deliver some dry cleaning, and DeLorean tries to pay the $13.50 bill with the keys to a DMC-12. Murphy says he already has 5, and they don't work. He'd rather have the $13.50. This was the new popular narrative about the legendary automaker, an inept drug smuggler whose car was a bust, but who still thought he was smarter than everybody else. The scandal was everywhere, and talk show host Phil Donahue articulated the allure succinctly when he said, "We love this kind of story. The mighty have fallen."
Whether John knew something was morally corrupt versus what he thought he could legally sort of justify in his mind to try and save the company, save these jobs that he was, trying to create in Northern Ireland there, and basically save his brand, which was the most important thing to him.
DeLorean's trial began in April 1984. He had first-rate lawyers in Howard Weitzman and Donald Ray, but it was not clear how they could possibly overcome the incriminating video footage. The government's star witness, James Hoffman, was a drug smuggler and convicted perjurer who took the stand for 18 days. He had lived across the street from DeLorean's home in San Diego County and had turned informer in hopes of leniency. Hoffman testified that DeLorean proposed a drug deal to save his company. Jurors heard his conversations with DeLorean in the secretly recorded footage. Hoffman told DeLorean, "Nobody wants you to do something that you are uncomfortable with." DeLorean said he wanted to proceed and told Hoffman, "I'm relying on you saying there's no way of connecting me to this thing." Hoffman replied, "You're not going to be handling product." According to the testimony of a former Drug Enforcement Administration agent, Hoffman had said, "I'm going to get John DeLorean for you guys." The problems he's got, I can get him to do anything I want. Filmmaker Tamir Ardone's view is that DeLorean was morally corrupt, but the legal case against him was thin, a product of the Reagan-era war on drugs.
You have to remember this is the early 80s. Having large profiled busts put on the map there publicly was something that was important at the time. When it became clear that John couldn't provide any upfront money for the government, that's when things took a real turn. At that point, they concocted very bizarre schemes that involved sort of providing letter of credits for John, and John being able to use useless stock options and sort of shell companies that he provided them. And that's where John sort of thought he was taking almost advantage of this bank and this drug dealer situation.
The defense argued that when DeLorean said he didn't have money for the deal, agents should have dropped the investigation. But in their zeal to entrap him, they concocted an elaborate financing scheme to keep him involved and stage managed the sting footage. That was why, according to the defense, the jurors should not trust the video that looked so damning.
The entire Room 501 setup was supposed to just be a very glitzy video to show jurors and for them to think that there's no way this guy isn't guilty until you start pulling back the curtain on the whole thing and you can tell that at the end of the day, it really did reek of entrapment.
Donald Ray's closing argument was a masterpiece. You can find it in the book, Ladies and Gentlemen of the Jury, Greatest Closing Arguments in Modern Law. He portrayed DeLorean as the victim of a manipulative snitch who had lured him with the prospect of legitimate investments in his company, only later introducing the notion of a drug transaction. By then, DeLorean was too scared to pull out. DeLorean was manipulated, Ray told jurors. DeLorean was maneuvered. DeLorean was conned. John DeLorean, in this case, was a victim of the people whose duty it was to protect him from criminal activity. DeLorean was a big target, he argued, and agents were angling for credit. In the New York and the LA office, they were fighting over this man's carcass, Ray said. What they were concerned about was their own ego and the publicity, what they could get and how good this would look in Time magazine. They wanted to influence you through this staged and misleading Hollywood performance and make you believe that DeLorean was guilty. The jury acquitted the automaker on all counts. Some jurors were convinced the government had acted inappropriately. It didn't mean that DeLorean was innocent. One juror said it was not guilty. The verdict was a huge embarrassment to the feds, and they acknowledged a big strategic mistake, failing to ensure that DeLorean had put up his own money. DeLorean said he had aged 600 years in 2 years. My life as a hardworking industrialist has been tattered and torn, he told the media. Would you buy a used car from me? DeLorean's wife, Christina Ferrari, had stood by him faithfully throughout the trial, but she left him afterward. In an interview a few years later, she said, I believe that John is a sociopath. DeLorean was 59 and his reputation was in ruins. He became a born-again Christian and told Playboy that he had been the victim of his own, quote, insatiable pride. He called it an arrogance that was beyond that of any other human being alive. John DeLorean's punishing drug trial and acquittal were fresh in memory when his car, the DMC-12, became immortalized in pop culture with an appearance in the 1985 hit Back to the Future. The movie makers needed a time machine, and they thought about using an old refrigerator. Instead, they opted for the gull-winged sports car and equipped it with the mysterious flux capacitor. DeLorean was ecstatic. He sent a gushing letter to the filmmakers, but he was still tangled in legal troubles. In 1986, DeLorean beat another federal case. this time in Detroit, on accusations that he stole $17.5 million from his investors. He tried to reinvent himself. He tried to market watches. He spoke of building a radical new car. His plans fizzled. He was saddled with legal bills. Creditors were circling.
To get caught up in the cocaine component, which basically turned him into a persona non grata when it came to the business world after the entrapment trial. After he was found out guilty of all these different trials, he could never resurrect his career. It was done. And that's what I meant by the brand. I mean, once the brand was tarnished, the DeLorean name, in that particular way, he could never regain the former glory that he had.
In the year 2000, the moving vans arrived at DeLorean's Bedminster estate to haul away his antiques.
Up until then, John had sort of been living a quiet life in Bedminster, New Jersey, on his 300-plus acre estate, which is now the site of Donald Trump's Bedminster golf course.
DeLorean was living in a New Jersey apartment when he died in 2005 at the age of 80. Dan Neal, who was the Los Angeles Times auto columnist at the time, called him, quote, the last of the automotive wildcatters, an arrogant, amoral hipster, a victim of his own toxic vanity. Weitzman, one of DeLorean's attorneys, said that of his many clients, John DeLorean had one of the most warped views of right and wrong. Comedian Jay Leno, a famous car collector, went on record to say he doesn't buy DeLoreans. In his teens, he idolized DeLorean as the man who gave the world the GTO and made the Pontiac cool, and later as the rebel who dared to launch his own car company. He was sort of a hero of mine, Leno said. But he just turned out to be another sleazy coke dealer. It just marred everything he ever did. It was just pure greed. By Ardone's estimate, there are about 6,000 DMC-12s on the road today, and the pristine ones can fetch six figures.
I've got some friends with over 800,000 miles on their cars, and they still look almost like brand new because the stainless steel never ages. I've had one now for over 25 years, and the comments at gas stations, where's the flux capacitor for dividing ages around 50 now? People under 50 will know the car only as the Back to the Future car and make Back to the Future jokes. And then people over 50 will have enough knowledge to also remember John as an automotive engineer and caught up in the drug scandal. So people ask me, where did they hide the cocaine when they were shipping the cars over?
I mean, is his downfall a consequence of winning so big for so long that he just thought that he was able to flout the rules and was invulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's that's what makes him such an interesting character.
The outsized ego, the risk-taking, the urge to break the rules, the traits that made his achievements possible were also arguably what destroyed him.
The risk had paid off for over 2-3 decades. Eventually your luck was going to run out.
From LA Times Studios, this is Crimes of the Times. To read more about these cases, check out Crimes of the Times at latimes.com. We also have a link to our video episodes in the show notes. This episode was written and reported by me, your host, Christopher Goffard. Our showrunner and senior producer is Jacqueline Kim. Executive editor is Deborah Anderlew. Production assistant is Jordan Patterson. Production services provided by JTB Studios. Our camera technicians and operators are Jeff Amlott, Julia McCabe, and Jason Newbert, with additional production support from Andrew Gombert, Patrick Stewart, and Anne-Marie Hauser. Denise Callahan is our studio manager. Ben Church is our production manager. Special thanks to LA Times Studios President Anna Magzanian, President and Chief Operating Officer of the Los Angeles Times, Chris Argenteri, and Executive Editor of the Los Angeles Times, Terry Tang. Crimes of the Times is executive produced and co-created by Derek Sean, and me, Christopher Goffard.